Now that we know something about ventilation and the factors that affect lung ventilation, let's take a look at some additional features of the pulmonary system. Spirometry is a strategy for assessing the function of the respiratory system by measuring inspired and expired gas volumes. So this orange sort of Sharpie looking drawn line is supposed to represent the output of an instrument called a spirometer, which is measuring the volume of gas being inspired whenever the line goes upward and the amount of gas expired whenever the line goes down. The little bumps here at the left are what's called tidal volume. It's the volume of air that you're breathing in and out of your lungs as you sit at rest. And when you take a look at the inspired volume of the tidal volume, there's obviously some additional volume you can inspire into your lungs. So if we look at the maximum amount you can possibly inspire voluntarily, the difference between the maximum and that tidal inspiration is called the inspiratory reserve. How much additional air can you bring in? And likewise, the amount of additional air you can forcibly expire after a tidal expiration. All the way down here, this is the most you can possibly force out of your lungs. That's expiratory reserve volume. The total amount of volume that you can voluntarily control, breathing in and out, is called the vital capacity. Right? Starting from the maximum you can possibly inspire, start there and measure the amount of gas you can force out of your lungs. The maximum amount, that's the vital capacity. So tidal volume plus expiratory reserve volume plus inspiratory reserve volume equals vital capacity. So those are vital capacity, as we'll see later, is a good clinical diagnostic indicator of certain types of lung disease. One more thing I'd like to point out in this diagram is that even when you expire all the air you can possibly force out of your lungs, there's still quite a lot of volume left in there. More than a liter of air is left in your lungs. And as we mentioned last time, it's really important to keep your alveoli, the air sacs, inflated. If they become completely deflated, it's very hard to re-inflate them. So we never do. We keep all the alveoli partially inflated and just inspire and expand them a bit, expire and let them recoil a bit, and that works great. So we have the residual volume, the amount of air that we cannot remove from the lungs. And so spirometry can't get at that volume directly. There's some tricks to get at it, but I do want you to know about tidal volume, expiratory reserve volume, inspiratory reserve volume, and vital capacity minimally. I'll be able to define those terms. Let me introduce something very interesting to you called anatomical dead space. When you expire some air, let's say this big purple sphere represents all of the air in your alveoli, and you just expired and you're about ready to take a new breath, there's a bunch of air still in your trachea, in your bronchi, and all the branches and the bronchioles. All that air has already been in your lungs. It's already essentially, in a way, what we might say, used. And it's just sitting in all those airways. And then when you go to inspire some fresh air, the first thing that happens is that 150 mils of air that's in those airways goes right back down into the alveoli. It's not in any way helpful. It has no fresh air. It's not full of oxygen. That's called anatomical dead space. That sort of, in a way, useless volume of air that first goes into your lung as you inspire, and then on top of that you bring in some nice fresh air from the atmosphere around you that's got lots of oxygen in it. So whenever we inspire air, we got to think, wow, how much of that inspired air was actually anatomical dead space volume? One way of assessing the functioning of the respiratory system is by calculating the minute ventilation. How much air, how many liters per minute of air is being pumped in and out of this system. And we measure that by looking at the tidal volume, right? That's that resting inflation and deflation, inspiration and expiration, times the frequency, breaths per minute. We get liters per minute of gas. Well, the thing about it is, though, that doesn't account for anatomical dead space. How much of that minute ventilation is actually that 150 mils just moving back and forth in the airways into the alveoli and back into the airways and so forth? Not very helpful in terms of getting oxygen into the body. So we have a different metric that's much more useful. It's called the alveolar ventilation rate, or sometimes just the alveolar ventilation. It's the amount of fresh air reaching the alveoli per unit time. And we simply subtract the dead space from the tidal volume when we're figuring out the alveolar ventilation rate. So we have frequency, breaths per minute, times the tidal volume minus the dead space volume. And now we get a good idea of how much fresh air is getting into the alveoli. So if you're, for example, breathing rapidly but shallowly, a lot of the volume you're moving back and forth is just dead space volume, so it's not very effective in bringing in oxygen. Deeper breathing, where a smaller fraction of the overall volume is dead space, is much more effective. So you could have the identical minute ventilation, breathing quickly and shallowly, or breathing deeply and less frequently, and the deeper breathing is going to be much more effective in terms of alveolar ventilation. Okay, here's another little feature of the respiratory system that we should investigate, that we be aware of. We already looked at the circulation, so we know that there's two heart pumps, two circuits through which blood is pumped. The left ventricle pumps blood through the systemic circulation. All these capillary beds represent all the organs in your body, and that blood, after it's gone through a capillary bed, comes back to the right heart, which is then pumped through the pulmonary circulation to the lungs to be oxygenated. Well, there's one last little sort of point of trivia we should mention, and that is that this low pressure system, we said there's only about 20-something millimeters of mercury arterial pressure in the pulmonary arteries. That's what gets the blood oxygenated for the use of your body, but there's got to be some oxygenated blood brought to all the tissues of your lungs to feed the cells. So there's a capillary bed. I kind of labeled this one down here, but you have to imagine there's some arteries coming from your aorta, some part of the systemic circulation that has capillary beds throughout your lungs that provides fresh, rich, oxygen-rich blood to all those structures. It's not a very large amount of blood volume per unit time, but there is this part of the high-pressure systemic circulation is dedicated to the lungs. So if you imagine this capillary bed right here, imagine it being sort of overlaid up here onto the lungs. So that's called the bronchial circulation. It's regular, high-pressure systemic blood, 120 millimeters of pressure of arterial blood coming to the bronchial circulation, whereas in the pulmonary circulation we have this very low pressure, 5 liters per minute at rest of low pressure circulation. Here's a little illustration here. We see the pulmonary circulation, 5 liters per minute of blood coming through the pulmonary arteries to all the capillaries of the alveoli. Pulmonary veins carry it back to the left heart. But there's some small arteries of the bronchial circulation carrying 120 millimeter mercury pressure oxygenated blood to the lungs to feed all the cells of these tissues, and then it goes back to the heart. Are you ready for some serious trivia? When that blood from the lungs, from the bronchial circulation, comes back to the heart, it isn't, I guess it's not really accurate to use one of these little diagrams to represent the bronchial circulation, because that blood comes from the aorta essentially over to the bronchial circulation, and it goes right back into the pulmonary vein. So a small amount of blood that's already been used, if you will, passing through the lung tissues, comes into and dilutes some of the freshly oxygenated blood coming from the lungs in the pulmonary circulation, right? So the pulmonary circulation, this blood, as we'll see later, is packed with oxygen. We're going to add some blood that has less oxygen to that and dilute it a little bit. Anyway, so this is just a fun little diagram showing you that we bring in a certain amount, like if we're just looking at the ventilation of the lungs at rest, and we bring in maybe 840 mils per minute of air containing oxygen. Some of that oxygen diffuses over into the blood, and we breathe out a lot of air. And we don't use up all the oxygen that's in the inspired air. We take some of it out, but a lot of the expired air still has plenty of oxygen left in it. And so that's what's represented here. About 250 mils of oxygen is taken up in the blood per minute, and then that oxygen circulates through the systemic circulation to all the tissues of your body for their use. CO2, the CO2 is produced in the cells, and so we have quite a lot of CO2 in the blood now. If you come through the tissues, 2,800 mils of CO2 in the blood comes through the right heart, gets sent to the lungs, and about 200 mils of CO2 per minute gets expired out into the atmosphere around us. So there's still a lot of CO2 left in the blood, as you can see. We just add a little bit to that, and then get rid of a little bit. And we just keep a certain amount of CO2 in the blood, and we'll see why that's so important. That is the signal for the regulation of ventilation. We've got to leave some CO2 in the blood all the time to monitor, to keep track of how well we're ventilating. Okay, let's learn a little bit about blood gases. Yeah, gases in our lungs and our blood. Dalton's law of partial pressure says that if you have a bunch of gases in a mixture, the total pressure of all those gases is equal to the sum of the partial pressures of each one. In other words, the air in the room contains nitrogen. There should be a little 2 here, N2. I don't know what happened there. So we have a partial pressure of nitrogen, partial pressure of oxygen. If you add these two together, they come out to almost 100% of the total gas. Nitrogen is around 80% of the gas, oxygen is around 20% of the gas, so, but they don't represent the entire amount. There's also a tiny bit of CO2, there's a little bit of water vapor, and some other very rare gases. The total amount of pressure, what is that all about? Well, gravity is acting on a great big pile, about a mile deep pile of air molecules sitting on top of us, and they have mass. And we don't think of them, we don't even think of them as being there, but there's a big pile of massive gas molecules sitting on top of us, so much so that this is the pressure that they exert, the force per unit area on everything around you and in you and on you. Isn't that amazing? If we think of 120 millimeters of mercury blood pressure as being high, look how much air pressure is sitting upon us. Well, actually, though, that's not all one gas. It's all these different gases, and each one of these gases contributes to that 760 millimeters. How much? By virtue of what fraction of the total gas it is. So, for example, oxygen is around 21% of the air around us. What is the partial pressure of oxygen? The amount of pressure it's exerting out of that 760 millimeters. Just multiply 0.21 for 21% times 760. We see that in the room around us, or in the air around us, is 159 millimeters of mercury, partial pressure of oxygen. So that's what we're going to stick to when we're talking about the amount of oxygen in the blood all the time, or in the alveoli. We're going to talk about partial pressures, because that's really what's going to drive gases moving from one place to another and so forth. So that's how much oxygen is in the room, or in the atmospheric air. What if we climbed up to 10,000 feet elevation? What would happen? Oxygen is still 21% of the gas. That's its percent in the mixture. Look about how much total pressure there is up there, though. Now the pile of air is much more shallow, and there's only 563 millimeters of mercury of air pressure upon us, times 0.21 tells us that up on top of the mountain at 10,000 feet elevation, there's only 110 millimeters of mercury partial pressure oxygen, so a lot less oxygen up there. How about CO2? CO2, not very much CO2 in the air around us, and that is kind of funny to think about. It's so low, if we multiply the amount of the percent of CO2 in the air around us times the total pressure, 760 millimeters of mercury air pressure, we see that there's only a very, very tiny partial pressure of CO2. The reason I say that's kind of funny is because we spend your whole academic life up until this point thinking about how the plants take CO2 out of the atmosphere and they so-called fix CO2 to create organic compounds. They magically can take CO2 out of the atmosphere and make sugar out of it. That's no small feat, but there's not much CO2 there to work with, but they can still manage to do it. So for our purposes, we're going to say there's no CO2 in the air, 21% oxygen, and there's plenty of CO2 in the blood, though, as we saw. We're going to leave some in there all the time. All right, another interesting point. Henry's law says that if you take a container with some water in it and then place some gas above that water under pressure, the amount of gas that will dissolve in that water depends on two things: the solubility of the gas and the partial pressure of the gas. How much is the gas forcing its way down onto the water and the air molecules sort of working their way in? So if we compare CO2 and oxygen, put them both in a container under the identical pressure in a little with water sitting below it, how much would dissolve in the water? Well, CO2 is 20 times more soluble in water than oxygen. So a lot more CO2 would dissolve at a given partial pressure. As we saw, there's hardly any partial pressure of CO2 to speak of in the air. Anyway, just an interesting point which will come up later as we discuss partial pressure differences in different places in the circulation. So let's do that. It's worth remembering some of these values for partial pressures. Well, all these values, but there's only a few you need to know because you'll see some of them kind of repeat themselves. Let's look at the composition of alveolar gas. We said there's 159 millimeters of mercury partial pressure in the air around us. We inspire that air coming down into the alveoli, and look what happens. We've all of a sudden lost a bunch of oxygen partial pressure. Whoa. Why is that? Well, for one thing, we've just mixed the incoming air with dead space volume, which has way less oxygen in it, and it dilutes some of the oxygen. So we have less partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolus. It also turns out there's a couple of other factors. We're going to humidify the air. We're going to introduce another gas, namely water vapor, and that's going to displace some of the oxygen. And some oxygen's always diffusing away. So anyway, this is we're just going to say the alveoli have around 105 or even 100 millimeters of mercury partial pressure oxygen. How about CO2? The alveoli at normal resting ventilation have 40 millimeters of mercury partial pressure CO2 in them. We're bringing in the air with none, but CO2 is always diffusing into the alveoli, and then we breathe that air out and then bring in some fresh air. So the alveoli kind of have, on average, have these values for blood gases, or for gases. As the blood passes through the lungs, it will equilibrate with the alveoli, meaning become exactly the same in terms of partial pressures. So the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolus is essentially going to be the same as the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood when it leaves the lungs. 100 millimeters of mercury partial pressure oxygen, 40 millimeters of mercury partial pressure of CO2, because it's going to match the alveolus. All right, so let's see what happens. We're going to bring that blood around to the tissues, and as oxygen diffuses away, the partial pressure falls. So when the blood leaves the tissues, typically, there's around 40 millimeters of mercury partial pressure of oxygen left. And as we bring the CO2 into the tissues, we're going to add some CO2 to the gas, so to the CO2 that's in the blood. So now we have 46 millimeters of mercury partial pressures. We're going to carry this as the so-called venous blood of the systemic circulation. We'll bring it to the lungs. What are we going to do? We're going to build it back up to 100 millimeters of mercury partial pressure of oxygen. Right? It's going to match the alveoli. We're going to have oxygen diffusing in. And we're going to get rid of 6 millimeters of mercury of CO2. It's going to diffuse out into the alveoli and leave us with 40. So that's the story. These are the numbers. So they're worth remembering again. And we'll see, especially the partial pressure of CO2 in arterial blood, 40 millimeters of mercury, and you'll see that's going to be kind of a mantra of ours. External respiration, gas exchange in the lungs. The diffusion, the rate of gas exchange in the lungs depends on, so it's limited by certain physical properties of the respiratory membrane. The respiratory membrane, you may remember, we said is represented by the type 1 alveolar cells that make up the wall of the alveolus, the basement membranes, and then the endothelial cells of the capillaries around the alveoli. That's the respiratory membrane. So the rate of diffusion, volume of gas per unit time, depends on the driving force, the difference in pressure. Right? What's the difference in pressure between the alveolus? 105 millimeters in here, only 40 millimeters of mercury partial pressure of oxygen. Difference 60 or so, 65 millimeters of mercury. That's the delta P, the driving force. Big difference in partial pressure. A stands for the surface area of the respiratory membrane. The surface area is huge. We said it's around 75 square meters of surface of all that respiratory membrane of 500 million alveoli. That's pretty amazing. So the area, right? The broader the area, the more we can get through gas we can get through there. Solubility of the gas. As we mentioned, CO2 is 20 times more soluble, so we can get a lot more CO2 moved for every difference in partial pressure. In the denominator, the distance. We have a minimal distance for diffusion because we have such thin, simple squamous epithelial cells, so it's not really an issue unless we do something like add some water. What if we start getting edema in the lungs, some water accumulating in the lungs? Then that D number is going to start getting big, and we're going to start not getting very much gas through the respiratory membrane. And of course, the molecular weight of the gas. So Here's something that's maybe a little bit surprising to note for the first time entering into the discussion of the lungs. Ventilation-perfusion coupling, or ratio. Ventilation means the volume of air coming in and out of the lungs per unit time. And Q stands for perfusion. Perfusion means the flow of blood. That's what it means. How much blood is flowing through a given tissue. That's the perfusion of the tissue. That's what we're going to call Q. So in the lungs, it turns out that the lungs aren't uniformly well ventilated from top to bottom, and they're not uniformly perfused equally from top to bottom. So at the top of the lungs, we have some alveoli that don't get that good of blood flow, right? They're poorly perfused, but they're very well ventilated. So when we do our ratio, we wind up with a very large number, because low blood flow and high ventilation, you get a very large number. It's a little exaggerated here, but so that's normal at the top of the lungs at rest. Also, if you had a pulmonary embolism, what if a big blood clot crashed in your lungs and blocked a whole bunch of the vasculature of your lungs? You'd have a whole bunch of blood, or a whole bunch of places in your lung where there's a lot of air coming in, but there's no blood flowing by because it's blocked. So you have, that's called physiologic dead space. We learned about anatomical dead space. That's the airways and so forth. Now we're talking about physiological dead space because of that ventilation perfusion mismatch in your lungs, it's called. Physiological shunt is the opposite. What if you have an area in your lung that's relatively poorly ventilated, not getting much fresh air, but very well perfused? Blood is coming through, but it's not getting any oxygen. That's called shunt. It's bypassing. Whenever you see the word shunt, we're talking about blood that's bypassing something. In this case, it's bypassing the alveoli. It's not getting any oxygen. So, towards the lower regions of your lung at rest, there's not zero VQ ratio, but there's physiologic shunt to some degree. There's areas that are, it's not as well ventilated down there at the bottom. There's lots of blood flow. All right, so those are some interesting definitions. Now let's see what happens in your lungs in order to make sure that that doesn't produce a deleterious effect on our well-being. What happens when you have a poorly ventilated area of your lungs? That means that there's not so much oxygen there, a low partial pressure of O2 we can now call it. What's going to happen? Vasoconstriction. That's autoregulation. We're not going to send blood to that part of the lung where there's not good ventilation. What if we had an area of the lung that's excellently ventilated, high partial pressure of oxygen? That causes arterioles to vasodilate in the lungs. We're going to send all the blood to that part of the lung where there's good ventilation. There's another facet of this. If you have part of the lung that's poorly ventilated, there's going to be an accumulation of CO2 because we can't get it out of the lung very well, and that causes bronchodilation. The smooth muscle in the bronchioles will dilate to help improve the ventilation in that area. And also, if there's poorly perfused alveoli, meaning there's excellent gas exchange, and we're getting rid of CO2 readily, but we're not bringing in very much CO2, that causes bronchoconstriction. We're bringing in too much air relative to the amount of blood flow. And you can see between these two automatic smooth muscle-based control systems, built-in control systems, intrinsic mechanisms, we can keep the ratio of ventilation to perfusion quite well balanced throughout the lung. Now when you exercise, there is no VQ imbalance. The lungs are pretty uniformly well ventilated and well perfused all the time from top to bottom. How about abnormalities of ventilation and perfusion? Emphysema, obstructive disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. That's the name that's usually given to people that have emphysema, because usually they also have bronchitis, inflammation in the lungs. Anyway, people that have COPD have poor gas exchange. They have very poor ventilation. They can't breathe in and out adequately. It's very hard to expire air. It's called air trapping. So they don't ventilate well at all. They have the perfusion and they can't get the ventilation well initially. So what happens? The entire lung now is not getting good oxygen. We can't bring in enough oxygen to meet the needs of the body. So blood is flowing in there, and what happens? We have autoregulation. vasoconstriction in the entire lung. Instead of just in areas that are poorly ventilated, we have vasoconstriction everywhere, right? Because the arterioles just think it's a spot where there's a bad ventilation area. What happens is that creates a huge resistance to blood flow in the lungs, and as the right heart tries to force the blood through, which it must do, we have pulmonary hypertension, high blood pressure in the pulmonary artery now, and it's going to cause right heart failure ultimately. Well, in emphysema, what happens is the alveolar walls become destroyed, and we lose the surface area of the respiratory membrane. So not only is it hard to ventilate physically, we can't breathe enough air in and out, we can't exchange gas as well because we don't have enough surface area. We just lost a lot of that surface area. So the whole lung is kind of like an area of physiological dead space. So you can see how complicated it's getting for the people that have COPD, a very nasty situation indeed. So join me next time, and we'll talk more about the alveolar gas composition and how that's impacted by changes in ventilation. We'll talk about the binding of oxygen to hemoglobin and the factors that kind of promote that in the lungs and yet help us get the oxygen off the hemoglobin in the tissues, and how the gases are transported in the blood.